morning, everybody. Welcome to NTWC Plus. It is August the 21st, and here we are and getting closer and closer to the peak of the hurricane season. And I'm pleased to say we don't have anything to talk about. Phil's tropical update should be quick today. We'll get to that a little bit later on. A great program for you today. I think we're going to talk about risk communication in particular, of course, severe weather risk, whether it's hurricanes, tropical storms, or anything else. But I think it's going to be a fascinating conversation today. Dr. Rebecca Morss is with us, so we'll get to her in just a moment. I want to start by saying we thank our sponsors who are part of this program week in and week out. We couldn't do it without you. We start with the USAA. They've been part of this program from the very beginning, and we appreciate your support, USAA, for making this a possibility. The South Padre Island Convention and Visitors Bureau. South Padre Island is the host of the National Tropical Weather Conference every year in the month of April. We'll be back there in April of 2025. We hope you'll join us the first week of April. Also, the Weather Company, Weather Boy, and Weather Call, all the folks who make these events possible. A couple of folks are with us week in and week out. Hurricane Hal is with us this morning. Hurricane Hal, where are you today? It looks like a hotel room somewhere.
It is. I'm in a quaint little town called San Antonio, Texas. I'm here at the Texas Groundwater Summit. I was a keynote speaker yesterday, and I'm here through tomorrow. A lot of communication here, which relates to our broadcast this morning with Dr. Rebecca Morss.
Terrific. I'm anxious to hear more about that in just a second. And with us, as always, former director of the National Hurricane Centers from somewhere in Southeast Texas. Good morning, Bill Reed.
Good morning, Tim. Got a lovely dew point of 81 right now, so summer's in its full mode. We tied a record in Galveston, record high yesterday at 97, which it only lasted a year on its solo act because we were the same thing last year. And the heat index was 118 at the time. So indoor activities are highly recommended, especially for old fools like me.
We were talking about this before the show that the record was set last year. Last year at this time, we were doing this a lot. We were sitting at, lows in the low 80s and stuff. So this year, at least hasn't been so bad, right?
This is a normal, to me, a normal summer where you'll have a week or so of excessive heat relative to normal for here, and the rest of the time it's just a nuisance heat, if you will. Last year in Houston, we had 30 out of 31 days where it went 100 or above, which was unheard of. So we're not anywhere close to like last summer.
So quite a contrast. So we'll take, last summer we're setting all kinds of records. I think we had 8 or 10 records in our studio in South Texas in the month of August, record highs, and we haven't set any this month. So even though we had 101 yesterday, not a big deal. So we'll take it. All right, let's go back to Hal. Hal, you can introduce our guest, and let's get this program started.
Yeah, for sure. We're so excited to have Dr. Rebecca Morss with us today. She's with the Mesoscale and Microscale Meteorology Lab, as well as the NSF National Center for Atmospheric Research, often called NCAR. She does so much out there, very applied communication work. I think our listeners are going to really, really love our interview with Rebecca today. She is an expert in weather forecasting systems and risk communication with an emphasis on high impact weather, including hurricanes, floods, fires, and tornadoes. She brings more than 20 years of experience in developing and implementing research programs, conceptualizing and leading projects, and building collaborative teams. Her work focuses on integrating knowledge, methods, and data across fields to address problems that are cross disciplinary boundaries in order to bridge science and technology with societal needs. Rebecca, so excited to have you today on NTWC Plus. Rebecca,
It's great to be here.
Rebecca, you're doing such great work that's very applied across all these different disciplines. I mean, tell us a little bit about this research. We know from your intro that you're working with hurricanes, floods, fires, tornadoes. Are there some of these common risk perception and communication issues that you're seeing across all of these disciplines, and what are they?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, there are definitely common issues. The issues about, communicating the risk and people making decisions to be able to protect themselves are common across them. There are some differences in timescales. So hurricanes, for evacuation, people usually have a few days, whereas for tornadoes, they might just have minutes. But in all of these risks, people are making decisions across time. So you make decisions early, whether you're thinking about evacuating and planning and then evacuating, or if you don't evacuate, as the time gets closer, you can do other kinds of things to protect yourself. So it's really fascinating. It's a great area of research and I love it.
Rebecca, I know you're doing so many different things. Could you give us kind of a bird's eye view of your professional landscape? I mean, what are the main things that you focus on professionally?
Yeah, I focus on a few different things. One is on the weather prediction predictability side, is trying to extend the lead time of predictions and be able to predict different issues of hazards associated with not just that a hurricane coming, but whether there's going to be storm surge or other kinds of flooding or in their position, emergency as well as members of the public, and how they interact to be able to use the information.
I think Rebecca, we're losing your signal. I'm going to ask that you maybe pop out and come back in, because we've got a weak signal there. So let's do that, and we can do the tropical update while we do that. So if you don't mind, just kind of pop out of the discussion, and then when you log back in, we'll see if we can get a better connection, because we're losing you. So you don't mind, let's try that. And while we do that, Bill, why don't you go ahead and jump forward? We'll do the tropical update, and then we'll come back to Dr. Morss as quickly as we get her back online.
Yeah, we haven't had one of those hiccups in a while. So, okay. Yeah, last week we were chomping down on Ernesto and its impact potential for Bermuda, which did come to pass. Our resident hurricane chaser, Josh Morgerman, as expected, managed to punch another eye of a storm by going to Bermuda, which he had never done before. So, but this week's a totally different animal. Let me find where I was at, and I'll share the screen here. Okay, this is the wide view of the tropical Atlantic, and if you ask somebody to date it, they would probably go with something like sometime in July, or maybe even sometime in late October, given that there's sort of a frontal boundary indication on the convection there. But you certainly wouldn't think of the 21st of August as being storm or even worthy of note easterly wave on the map to talk about. And obviously from that, this is not a big surprise that the outlook for the tropical Atlantic for the next 7 days is no development. And really the models aren't that excited about things beyond that until you get out in the fantasy land of beyond 10 days. And I'm not going to go there. However, when it's quiet in one basin this time of the year in the Northern Hemisphere, it's not quiet in another. And we have 3 spinners going on out here in the Eastern Pacific. One's a hurricane. I'll talk a little bit about Gilma there. Almost developing, it's 90% on the outlook system out here. There used to be 2, and rather complex mergers going on there. So I think there's probably some uncertainty on the exact prognosis of it, depending on where exactly a center forms on that. And then there's as yet to be organized area of convection out here that is looking favorable for development, perhaps come the end of the week or the weekend. This is the official outlook on it, and it's all red. This is the one I won't spend time on because it's later on this week or in the weekend when it's expected to form. But you notice they're all kind of lined up, the same areas of the ocean it's going to cross as it goes on there, which is interesting to me at least. And okay. Satellite loop of Gilma. It's made it up to hurricane strength last night, and it briefly had an opened up eye visible in there, but the strong convection and the outflow thereof have covered what that was. I suspect there's still an eye in there. It's just covered with the cirrus canopy right now. Gilma's forecast. Let me update that. They should have a new one. There we go. It's still intensifying. It's now up to 85 miles an hour. It's forecast to reach major hurricane status for a 12 to 24-hour period tomorrow, and then begin a slight and slow weakening trend as it keeps going west. It's far enough south that the colder water and drier air is just on the northern periphery of where it's going. So it's going to bear watching for quite a while. It doesn't cross into the the Central Pacific region, which concerns Hawaii, until sometime early next week beyond this forecast cycle. Our next one in the food chain, I can actually see some circulation. It looks like it's on the north edge of this convection here, so it hadn't got its act completely together, but it wouldn't surprise me if it doesn't in too many more iterations before it develops into something like that. The track guidance, it's a very well-defined steering current, and the reason I mentioned that you got to wait and see where it actually forms a center. If it forms a center on the north edge, it brings wouldn't surprise me if the track guidance brings Hawaii into play way downstream on that, or on the other side, if it forms a little further south, it may come further south of the Hawaiian Islands. Too far out to get too carried into that right now, but oops, go. All the models are fairly energetic with this and want to bring it up to at least a strong tropical storm, if not a Category 1 hurricane. Don't get too carried away with the intensity forecast that far out in time. If and when these things form, this is the Eastern Pacific. The next one in the food chain will be Hector. Hurricane Hector has a nice alliterative ring to it. And the one following, Ileana, in there. I think in the Atlantic, just for those like me who've forgotten, oh yeah, Francine and then Gordon will be the next two up, but they're not on our list as of right now. So guys, if you got any questions for me on that, and Rebecca, you can critique my communication skills or lack thereof.
Bill, you mentioned that the Atlantic looks more like mid-July instead of mid-August. I mean, why is that? Are we just seeing a lack of tropical waves coming off Africa? Are we seeing dry air out there? Any insights on that?
Yeah, that was probably not the best way to put that. It was really just the satellite image, knowing nothing else. But yeah, the factors and our guest from a few weeks ago, Michael Lowry, had an excellent discussion in his blog yesterday. Is the waves are forming over Africa a little farther north than normal, and they're tapping the Saharan air layer that's still active with dust. So the waves that are coming off are starved as far as convection, and they carry that dry air with them as they come across. The other factors, sea surface temperature and dynamics, the wind field and whatnot, are pristine. They're very low shear, and the ocean is still cooking along, especially as it gets closer to the Caribbean and the main development region at near record levels like they were last year. So if we see a change to where the waves start coming off with more convection, I think it'll start popping big time. But if you know somebody that can forecast that beyond 7 days, let me know.
Well, what do you see, Bill? You know, the CPC puts out their hazards outlook out, next weekend, basically. They've got a high risk area, basically, in the central Atlantic. The 60% plus, that's not a model, but,
It's off their climate models and with human input on it to get the exact forecast they put out for that. So that tells me that at least the longer range models beyond the operational models we use are targeting that area as development showing up.
So, well, I mean, at some point it's going to get busy. That's all I know.
I'll read up on that. I'll read up on that product for next week and maybe give you some insight on where that comes from.
That'd be terrific. Thank you. Thanks for the tropical update, Bill. Appreciate it. That's good to know. You had something to talk about, even though the Atlantic is surprisingly quiet.
I can talk about anything if you give me nothing.
And that's why you're so good at what you do. All right, Hal, let's get back to our conversation now. Dr. Morss is back with us again, hopefully better connection this time around. How you can pick up where we left off.
Yeah, for sure. Dr. Morss, I know our audience is going to be so excited to hear about your research. And I think, what we'd really love to hear is just kind of this bird's eye view of what you do and the different stakeholders you work with, some of these different issues that you're tackling.
Hi, Internet. And my audio is working okay now. So I study different kinds of weather and different kinds of weather risk communication. So I study prediction and improving extending the predictability of different kinds of weather like hurricanes and floods and tornadoes, as well as communicating the hazards and the risks associated with those. And so, yeah, it's a fascinating field. A lot of the work I do is interdisciplinary, where we combine meteorology and different fields of social sciences to understand how people make decisions and how we can really communicate the risks in the way that different groups can make decisions in the best way possible. So when a hurricane approaches, you have forecasters that are communicating and broadcast meteorologists, emergency managers that are using the information, members of the public, businesses, all kinds of groups. And so how can we communicate the information in a way that those groups can work together to make the best decisions possible to save lives and protect property?
Rebecca, that's really fascinating. And I think with hurricane forecasting, I want to drill down on this predictability. So obviously, forecasting and predicting the near future is going to be a lot more accurate than the distant future. But obviously, as humans, we want as much lead time as possible. So, for example, we've seen the National Hurricane Center go from a 5-day tropical weather outlook to now a 7-day. I mean, they're feeling the pressure of people saying we want more lead time. But then at what point do we find those thresholds where the accuracy just isn't there? I mean, how do we navigate those questions, I guess, as a society when it comes to hurricane forecasting?
Yeah, I mean, those are great questions. I first think the first thing to know is, even in my lifetime, I'm pretty young, but even in my lifetime, or longer, the last 30, 40, 50 years, weather predictions have gotten so much better. I mean, if you think about what hurricane, decision-making was like, 50 years ago, and how little warning there was, it's just amazing how much better the forecasts have gotten. Not only the longer lead times, but also the forecasts of different aspects of the risk, the wind, the storm surge, the flooding, those kinds of things. And what I've seen in the time I've been doing this is, as the meteorologists are able to extend the lead time a little bit, people just like, in the decision side, they just soak that up and use whatever they can. So a lot of it's really advances in the science that are making the predictions at longer lead times possible. And then people start to use those. There are some limits in terms of how far we can predict in advance. For example, I don't think anyone thinks, at least right now, that you can predict where a specific hurricane will go, 2 weeks, 3 weeks longer in advance. But it's really amazing that we do see some hurricanes, especially the ones that, form over the Eastern Atlantic and kind of have a long time frame, where we get a good idea of which area they might affect, a week or two in advance, which is pretty amazing. People still wait until it gets closer, usually, to make a lot of decisions, but people can start gearing up for the event, further in advance. And then, of course, there are some where there isn't nearly as much lead time.
Well, that's interesting, Rebecca. And as you're working with a wide range of stakeholders, I'm imagining some really want a precise forecast. There have to be stakeholders out there that say, can we just have a general idea what may happen in the 1 to 2 week range, even if there's a lot of uncertainty, right? Do you come across stakeholders that just want a general idea, but really want a longer lead time?
Yes, I think everyone would like to know, as much as they can, as far in advance as possible. But definitely for some stakeholders, those general forecasts a week or two in advance can be useful. For decision makers who might have to move a lot of resources, or even schedule to make sure that they have all the people in the office, that no one's taking vacation, because they might need all hands on deck in a week or two. Or for longer lead time decisions, like shipping decisions, where to move things or move, equipment, those kinds of decisions, it can be really helpful to have that longer lead time information, especially if you don't need to make decisions that cost a lot of money yet. So you might need to move things, but you can move them back, or they'll be needed where they're going eventually. You're just moving them a bit early, those kinds of things. That longer lead time can be really useful.
One of those stakeholders that comes to mind as far as longer lead time is the cruise industry. We have a very robust cruise industry along the Texas coast, for example, and people come in on a Friday night or Saturday to just decide where they're going to park their car. Sometimes we're looking at a potential tropical system, maybe 5, 7, 9 days out. We don't have precision on it yet, but it can affect them saying, hey, we want people to maybe park in a garage instead of on these lots that are at like 3 and 4 feet. Again, the storm's still maybe 6 or 8 days out, but just, I think, a general idea. I think sometimes I've seen people really appreciate just a general notion of what could happen.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And that's a decision that doesn't cost a lot, to park your car someplace else. But if the risk is there, then you can really make the decision further in advance. And of course, you wouldn't be able to do very much once you were on the boat. And so I think there's all of these kinds of little decisions. Often we don't even know about them, that people are making all the time, that, can really, really be helpful.
Rebecca, a two-part question for you. Number one, what are the big challenges you face in this field? And then the second part, what are the opportunities moving forward? Let's start with the challenges. I mean, risk communication, really this overlap between physical science and social science. What are the big challenges y'all face in this field?
Yeah, I think one of the big challenges is really going from communicating the weather to communicating the hazards and the potential impacts, which is what people really want to know. If you could predict things like power outages or, localized flooding or, infrastructure disruptions, that would be really useful. And so that's a big challenge. Another challenge is, I think, kind of fundamental, that it's difficult for people to understand the worst case scenario. It's really impossible when you interview people afterwards. You can't imagine where you live being under 8 feet of water, within a few minutes. And so that's so difficult for people. And so there's a real challenge in communicating when it's a once in a lifetime event for a lot of people, or even what they would think would never happen in their lifetime. How do you communicate to local decision makers, members of the public, emergency managers, when they have to face that worst case scenario? That's really a challenge. And then the flip side is the opportunities are really the same things. The opportunities are going from being able to predict a hurricane is coming to your area to being able to say these areas are more at risk for wind and these are more at risk for water and these areas are at risk for both. And then really getting people to stay paying attention. So as the storm gets closer, those forecasts gets updated and they can make more specific decisions. And then also the opportunities really to help people. What we see in a lot of our decisions is, a lot of our work is that there's a point when these events happen where people go from like, oh, this could happen, to like, oh no, this is really bad. And the earlier they make that decision, the better off they can be. If you are, in your house and the water's coming up and you are stuck and have to figure out how to go higher or go through your roof or hang on to something, that you don't want to be in that situation. If you can really imagine that it's really going to be that bad sooner, you can just make better decisions. So that opportunity to really help people see what could happen so that they can be as prepared as possible.
Rebecca, you mentioned in the worst case scenario, it's just hard for people to really imagine that. I mean, another way to think about it, the most extreme events are often outside of people's frame of reference. I mean, they can't even imagine that a storm surge could just completely annihilate an entire community, or that wind could cause structural failure even on well-built buildings. So it's just outside their frame of reference. I mean, any insights on how we can get people to envision what could happen when it's hard even for them to imagine it?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really difficult question. I think there has been some research recently. We've done some, as well as others, with things like looking at videos, so you can see how things happen over time, as well as virtual reality. So if people can, what we found is, for example, people might understand that storm surge is flooding, but they don't know how fast it can happen. They think they might have a day or two when they really don't. And so to understand really kind of the full space time, kind of what it looks like, it's going to be around you. It's going to happen quickly. You're not going to have these alternate options, you think. So that can really help people. There's a lot of research in that, as well as I mentioned, virtual reality can help people understand that it can happen. I also think there's just a fundamental issue about, you can't really imagine the worst thing is going to happen to you, because if you did, you wouldn't be able to function every day. So it's really like getting people, even if it's not, to just think it might be possible, so they can start to make decisions that, at least if they get there, then they can be as prepared as possible. Yeah, I think it's really sort of fundamental human nature, but yeah, I mean, we do this with all kinds of things, car accidents or whatever. We face all these different kinds of risks. And so there also might be ways where you can use parallels from other kinds of risks. Like, you didn't think that, this is not a great example, but 9/11 or things like that could happen, and yet they did. And so to kind of think through the scenarios, or at least be prepared if something does, as much as possible. A hurricane is more predictable than that, at least from what we knew at the time. And so,
Rebecca,
yeah.
what you're describing, we saw this so much on the ground in the field before, during, and after Hurricane Ian in Southwest Florida. I mean, we came across a lot of people afterwards that said, we heard the forecast loud and clear. We just didn't believe that could happen. I mean, it was just outside their frame of reference. And what you mentioned, as well as understanding what this will look like, how quickly the water will come up, or even Rob Perillo in Southwestern Louisiana, he talks about humanizing the forecast. Like, we can mention feet of water, but when you describe this will start sweeping away homes, or this will not be survivable on a first floor, taking these water levels or wind speeds and tying that into what this actually looks like. We've seen that will open people's eyes, like, wow, I didn't think that was possible. But like you said, when it goes from this could happen to this is likely to happen, at least maybe it can help more people make decisions to get out of harm's way.
Yeah, I think that that's really true. And I think it's just impossible to imagine, a place that you've lived forever, just experiencing the worst. I do think that it's important to remember that different people, different things, they make decisions in different ways or respond to risks in different ways. So different people, different kinds of communication are really meaningful for them. For some, it might be the words. For some, it might be the pictures. For some, it might be who's communicating, a trusted source, or different people have different kinds of trusted sources. So I think also pairing that with pictures and video of what could happen, really, at least for me, when I've seen those, when I first started doing this work, I remember seeing some videos and thinking, oh, that really is bad, right? And so having that picture, but somehow getting people to think that might not be just someplace else, it might be for me as well.
Rebecca, the famous meteorologist Bill Reed has been taking copious amount of notes. I think he has a whole bunch of questions for you, so I'm going to pass the mic over to him now. Look at all those notes. I knew it. I can
read them from here.
Page 1 of 2, If you can read that, you're a genius, because I'm not sure if I can read it. I was writing too fast. I'll start with where you guys right where you were, the whole denial thing. If you read the book called Unthinkable by Amanda Ripley.
I've heard of it, but I haven't read it, no.
You need to read it, because you actually, I think you had, because you described exactly, that was a huge eye-opener to me about 15 years ago, and she's updated it this year. And the thing that book left me with was we really didn't know how to crack through denial. I think, like the Ian example you guys were just talking about, there's a place that hadn't had anything in the memory of any of the folks that were living there. We seem to have a little bit of an advantage here in Galveston, is they've kept the memory of the 1900 storm alive. And I find people a lot more willing to accept the fact that they're borrowing that land rather than living on it than I have at other places. Still going on that, there's been so much change in how we do storm surge in the last 15 years. The best thing I did at Hurricane Center was hire Jamie Rome for the job. Do you see improvements in citizen understanding of the risk in the time frame since we went from just having a sentence in the warning to now having graphics and all?
Yeah, I think people do understand it better, but there's still a lot of areas of misunderstanding. I think it's just a really complicated concept. And then the information with the probabilities is just really hard for people to understand. And so I think there's still a lot of work to be done, but it definitely has gotten better, especially with people having seen, recent events. When you talk about Hurricane Ian, I've interviewed people after storms for, 20 or so years, and watching Ian was just one of those situations where, as an expert, bad things are going to happen and there's really not that much you can do about it. And just wanting to be able to do something was really hard. At the same time, I want to say that, for example, in my own town, we experienced a really surprising fire, the Marshall Fire, that almost burnt my house down, but did not, very thankfully. And having gone through that experience I live in the middle of suburbia, people were telling me their houses are on fire a few blocks away. And I was like, that's crazy. What are you saying? It doesn't even make any sense that the fire crosses all of this concrete and strip malls and things like that. And yet it does, right? And so having gone through that, I really realized how hard it can be to imagine these things and what your mind goes through when you're trying to really understand something you thought was unthinkable. And so, I think that we have to give people credit that they're doing the best they can. And we all have situations where we definitely wish we'd made a better decision. And we're just really lucky that it hasn't been in just a life or death situation like that.
Yeah. I have my dream scenario and the technology advances I've watched since I started worrying about this issue is the technology advances are going to get us to a point where, with the virtual reality and the AI computer skills and bandwidth, that we have an event coming at you. We can personalize it to where a person can get a visual of their house and what we expect to happen there. I think that's the point. It'll start becoming real to more people.
I think so. I think also that the challenge with storm surge is you really don't know where it's going to happen almost until it happens. And so how do you communicate that information and get people to realize it's a real risk and it's worth taking account for, because if it does happen, it's really, really, really bad. The force of the water is so much you can't really escape it, but yet it might not happen. That uncertainty that it's not a certain thing, but that it's still worth taking account of. so that people will not get overly scared or also, take action and then say, oh, well, you were wrong this time and so on. But there's also this piece about it that's for some people, when things are too scary, they shut down and they really can't take action. And so you don't want to scare them so much that they are not able to kind of process the information. So it's a real delicate balance.
Yeah, that's a good point. The thing I use for storm surge when I'm talking to people that are on the hedge about it is I can't tell you 48 hours out exactly where it's going to be, but every time you say, I'll wait till the information's more sure, you lose 6 hours of action. Mm-hmm. And reach a certain point where you don't have enough time to act. And that played out in Hurricane Ike on the Bolivar for a lot of people, unfortunately.
Yeah. Yeah, that was one of the first hurricanes that I studied and interviewed people, and it was so sad to talk to them. It was also hard to talk to people who had evacuated, but they didn't realize there was a risk of flooding. So they evacuated early and they thought the risk was wind. And so they didn't move their things in case of flooding. And then they were evacuated and realized, oh no, but then they couldn't do anything. So really, how do you get all of the possibilities of what can happen out early enough that people who do make decisions early can really make the best decisions possible?
That's why my only real factor on that for evacuation is that I have the information for my insurance policy with me. But here's one that I really struggle with because I don't know how to do it. How do you reach the broad spectrum of cultural differences? It's in any country, but it's especially true along our coastlines. It's a very different attitude is the word I use that I found in people living in South Florida when I was there compared to over here.
Yeah.
But how do you do that within the context of our warning and forecast system where we basically have the same forecast no matter where we're doing it?
Yeah, I think that's a difficult question. I think that a lot of people get information from broadcast meteorologists, the weather service, from social media, from meteorologists on social media, emergency managers, and so on. But a lot of the information people get is from families, friends, neighbors, and other people in their community. And so I think that really is an opportunity for the communication. If you think about different people that are communicating with each other all the time, then that really gives the opportunity for different messengers to get the information out. Some people, it might be from their church, or it might be from their trusted neighbor who they know is a former director of the National Hurricane Center. They know who they can go to. And so if you think about this really web of communication that people are getting, how do you get the information out and kind of updated so that all of these people who are communicating with each other are communicating the best information possible? And hopefully for different kinds of people in different cultures, they're getting information from someone that they trust or where they can understand the information where it makes sense to them.
That's true. I joke with my golf buddies because they ask when should we take one of these storms seriously. I said, if you guys will pay for the GoPro on the telephone pole out front, when you see somebody putting the window coverings up on my house, it's probably get your act together.
Yep.
Okay. Hey, Tim, I think you might want to do a sponsor break here and kick it back to Hal and anything you've got coming in on your end.
Yeah, let's do our midpoint break and talk about the folks who make these programs possible each and every week, and we appreciate them being here. In particular, USAA. Boy, we love you guys, USAA. You've been instrumental in making these programs a reality. Not just this, but the National Tropical Weather Conference, the in-person event, and of course, everything we do at the Storm Science Network. A lot of events we've done over the years, and we appreciate USAA for being a loyal and proud sponsor of these events. The South Padre Island Convention and Visitors Bureau, we will be back live on South Padre Island in April of 2025. We invite you to be with us. Keep an eye out for registration information coming soon. You'll be able to register for the 2025 conference, and we hope to have you all out there at the beautiful Courtyard Marriott Hotel in South Padre Island. That'll be the very first few days of April of 2025. The Weather Company, Weather Boy, Weather Call, all folks that jump in and are part of this program each and every week, and we appreciate all that they do. Talk about Weather Boy. It's so cool what they do with bringing college students to the National Tropical Weather Conference live every year. They basically provide we do a contest, and it's basically providing scholarship for several college students from around the nation that are majors in meteorology, and pays for the trip. They pay for the trip, everything from the flights to the hotel to the meals. and provide an opportunity for each of those contest winners to sit down and have a one-on-one conversation with Bill Reed or Hal Needham or Dr. Rebecca Morss or somebody, whoever they want to talk to that's at the conference. And it's really a cool opportunity. So thanks to Weatherboy for that. We'll go back to the conversation. I do have some questions coming in, but Hal, before we do that, let's get your GeoTruck update, because I know you've always got something fun and exciting, and I can't wait to hear what you can talk about today.
Yeah, for sure. You know, with GeoTrack, we're exploring the world to tell these stories about extreme weather and natural disasters not covered by the mainstream media. So as much as possible, we like to get on the ground in disaster zones, do podcasts and video content with that. Just 2 weeks ago, we were on the ground in the Carolinas covering what became Tropical Storm Debbie after a hurricane landfall on the Florida West Coast. And we did a really interesting podcast there, interviewing people on the ground. Debbie was one of these stalled out systems. Again, we've seen so many of these stalled out hurricanes and tropical storms over the past decade. That was a big theme of that podcast. We featured scientist Jim Cosson from Wisconsin, who spoke about research he's done on these stalled out systems and how they not only impact communities at the coast, but well inland. Places like Raleigh-Durham were in the crosshairs. We've seen this before where Baton Rouge, Houston, Atlanta, Orlando, some of these inland cities that do not have a storm surge risk for a stalled out system, they could see 15, 20 plus inches of rain. So really interesting podcast. It was GeoTrek podcast number 101. You can listen to it wherever you listen to find podcasts, whether it's Spotify, Apple Podcasts, anything like that. And then also this week, I'm at the Texas Groundwater Summit in San Antonio, Texas. We've been interviewing a lot of people for a podcast that's coming out next week, just voices of the Texas Groundwater Summit. And what we're finding is some of these things we're finding with hurricanes and tropical storms, these challenges of communication, we're finding crossover into other areas that get heavy snow loads or drought, wildfires. Just a lot of these communication issues really are found throughout the spectrum. So you can find that podcast airing next week. Lastly, I gave the keynote presentation here yesterday, and my topic was communication as what I view as the last frontier in science. And most of my career, I would have said that last frontier is data. If we just have enough data to understand how the world works, to verify our models, we'll accurately predict. But what I've seen in recent years is sometimes we have a very accurate forecast and people are still getting blindsided. It just shows the importance of communication. So it related to my talk here at the conference, and it relates to what we're talking here today with Dr. Rebecca Morss.
Always great stuff, Hal. We appreciate that. I love the GeoTrek podcast. You ask good questions, week in and week out, and very inquisitive, and I think it's a fascinating conversation. I can see why it's doing so well in the podcast world verse, if you will. So thank you for that. We appreciate it. Okay, we got a couple of questions coming in from online. Let me jump into those. Barry is asking, and you probably know Barry Goldsmith, and very much a part of this conversation a lot. And he's saying we're pretty good at reasonable worst case scenario communication, but what about the situations between the reasonable worst case and the unknown worst case? Mm-hmm. That's where we got to figure out communication. There's a communication gap there. How do we get from reasonable worst case to the unknown worst case?
Yeah, I think that's a great question and a real open question. I also think the reasonable worst case, I think that people probably often don't know what exactly that means. And so some people probably think that means like the worst case, the worst thing that could happen. And some people think that it's very unlikely to happen. So I think that's one thing to think about. Then going back to what Hal was just saying, we have a lot of data about the natural world. We really have much less data about the social world and how people are making these kinds of decisions. And that data can be really hard to process. So I think really gathering information about how people are making decisions, how they're responding to different kinds of information is really important to understanding these questions and understanding how to communicate better. There's lots of different ways to study it, but a lot of the studies are really an idealized context where you give someone information and they think about it and respond. We really need data about how people are responding in real situations when they're under real pressure and their lives are at risk and so on. I think that's a great question. I don't have an answer, but I think there's something about, somehow communicating the reins of like what is possible and how bad it could be in a way that people realize it could happen and it's good to prepare for it, but it might not happen. And I think that's a really, really tough question. I don't have any answers, unfortunately, but it is, as Hal said, and I think you're saying a big frontier.
And along those lines, Casper's asking online, is how do we break the party first mindset that we see so often, as the storm's approaching? It says the localized mindset becomes infectious to people who are new to an area. It's like, oh, there's a hurricane coming, let's have a party. How do you break that mindset? They say no.
Yeah. I think that's a great question. I mean, what I've seen in the work I've done and others have done is that different people approach the situation differently. Some people have a party mindset first,
Period.
that, and some people don't. But what we'll also see, right? So I've talked to people who, no matter what happened, they were going to stay, and they were in situations just sound crazy. But often, sometimes what people do is like they'll stay, but they'll send their kids, their wife and kids out, or something like that. And so I think that. At some level, you can't help some people just making decisions the way they want to. And for some people, they really like the excitement. They love the risk. I talked to someone once who was like, there's a hurricane coming, I'm going to go out surfing. Like, they just really are thrill seekers, and that's what they're going to do. And so I think for those people, maybe you can't help them make a better decision unless they really face a bad circumstance. What you don't want them doing is putting others in those situations. And to the extent possible, you want them ready for when things take a turn for the worse, they have an option left. So having interviewed people who are in those kinds of situations, you want them not to have other people there with them who don't want to be in that situation or who are at risk and can't protect themselves. So you don't want them bringing other people with them who might not make that decision. And you want them to have a plan B when plan A, which is party, goes badly. You want to be ready for plan B as much as possible.
It seems like often, the uncertainty we've talked about is one of the most difficult things to explain, to express. Do you find that after a particularly good forecast for a storm, there's a storm that just, does exactly what the forecasters say it's going to do, expectations go up from the public after that because they say, well, they nailed that one. This is exactly what they're saying. It's exactly what's going to happen, when really that's not true, probably.
Yeah, I think Irma, for me, when I watched that was an example of that, where, a small change in where Irma went really made a big difference in which areas were impacted, given the track of Irma and the kind of the number of people in Florida and the shape of Florida and things like that. And it was a really amazing forecast to be able to forecast that storm so far in advance and have people evacuating across Florida. But still, people would like to know, which area of Florida, and the storm makes a small turn and it goes somewhere else. And so people's expectations really have gone up. I think with the uncertainty, what we've been talking about with some of the people I work with in that community is, there are things that are usually that so things like there's a hurricane, it is coming, it is probably going to affect one of these areas, and they're the parts that you don't know as well. But in some cases, like there is an area of Western Florida, for example, that's going to get inundated with storm surge. We don't know exactly how big that's going to be. We don't know where it is yet, but sometimes you do know those things. And so to communicate what you do know, and then, the different kinds of scenarios. In some of the work we've done, we do find that people like scenario-based communication because it helps them, as the situation evolves, see what's happening. So as the storm makes a turn, you can say, like, if the storm goes more south, it's going to, come in earlier probably, and it'll affect more of these areas, versus if it goes more north, it does this. And so people can kind of adjust as time goes on. But then again, it is really hard to predict that well. And so I think the most important thing is for people to stay updated and get the newest information, because the forecast can change. And so if people are staying updated, staying, attuned to their sources, when that forecast gets more specific or when there's a slight change, then they can learn about it as quickly as possible and shift their decision if they need to.
I think we get, tainted a little bit, maybe, and it's a hyper local effect that, I sit here in South Texas and I see this is an example, a storm headed for the east coast of Florida, and that forecast may vary between Miami Beach and Daytona Beach. To me, it's in the east coast of Florida. They did a really good job on that, whether it was, and that's hundreds of miles apart. But then suddenly when that bullseye is headed for us, and it varies by 100, 150 miles. Like, well, why can't we get it right when it's in our neighborhood, like they did in Florida? Well, it's all perspective, I think.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And the storms vary a lot. Some storms are just easier to predict than others, and a lot of it things depend on the size of the storm. A big storm, it's going to have an impact over a larger area. And so those specific details don't matter as much as a small storm. Also with a big storm, after it comes through, you see a larger area with damage. So you have this sense like, oh, even if I got lucky, all of these other people didn't get as lucky. Whereas with a smaller storm, there's less of that. So there's a lot of things that intersect to make this so difficult to communicate well and for people to kind of understand what the forecasts mean and what's possible.
Al, I know you've been just thinking about more questions, a lot more stuff to talk about. So jump back in here.
Oh yeah, this has been fantastic. Rebecca, earlier this summer, Hurricane Beryl put a big hit on Southeast Texas. The
Mhm.
Houston Galveston corridor where Bill and I live, a lot of people were blindsided. We had 2.7 million people out of power, which is a major problem during the Texas summer. We had a lot
Mhm.
of people, especially elderly and with health issues, have heat-related illnesses and unfortunately fatalities. And I feel like a lot of people were blindsided. They said, look, we were never in the cone. I mean, maybe on one or two of the forecast runs, we were in the edge, but for the most part, we weren't in the cone. And so people continue to think of that cone that we see go
Yeah.
viral from the National Hurricane Center. A lot of people really think of that as an impacts cone, but a lot of times we see the wind and water impacts way outside the cone. What are your thoughts on that? It seems like a communication challenge where often that one graphic is going viral, but then we're seeing the wind and flood impacts far outside the cone. How do you see that we could navigate that to communicate tropical hazards better to people along the coast and inland?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. It's something that I've been working on for more than 10 years, and a lot of people in the community have. I think it'd be great to hear Bill chime in because he probably knows more about the history of the cone and how it came to be than a lot of us do, or the official version, I guess. But yeah, I think the cone is an example of a product that's so successful and that everyone knows it. Everyone knows they think they know what it means and they look for it. I mean, we've done, studies of social media where the cone comes out and people tweet it right away. And it's just people, when it comes out, it's a thing. I think part of the issue is that as the forecasts have gotten better, the cone has narrowed because it represents the historical forecast uncertainty of the last 5 years. And so 10 or 20 years ago, the cone was wider, and so it covered more areas. And so as it's gotten narrower, it does a less successful job of forecasting impacts. And the way people were able to interpret it 10 years ago, it's probably different now because it is narrower. And so I know the Hurricane Center and other people have been working on, ways to enhance the cone, ways to supplement the cone with other information. I don't think anyone's found something else yet that people are just so excited about that they will latch onto that is a way that is hazard communication that is more effective. So I think that remains to be seen, but I think a lot of creativity in terms of people trying different things, and maybe there'll be something else that communicates the risk of areas under different kinds of hazards, that could be more viral and kind of more compelling to people. I also think when I think of the cone now, what I think of it as, it's just a sign of whether you should pay attention and get more information. And basically, if you're anywhere near it, you should be gathering more information to see what the risks are for you. And I think that there's a lot that can be done potentially with people that are communicating with the cone to make sure to emphasize that. I think when we look on Twitter, for example, there's a lot of tweets that are just like the phone cone first comes out and people tweet the cone. Maybe they say something in the text, but people might not read it. And so it's really like, how do you emphasize the key message that you want to get across with the information, which is like, if you're anywhere near, look for more information, pay attention, stay updated, start looking at what could happen in your area, and don't, unless you're way, way outside, don't stop paying attention.
Yeah. Rebecca, it sounds like you're saying just knowing that something's out there, this should be on your radar, warning bell, pay attention to this. But again, maybe not get too specific. I have noticed too, watches and warnings have been added to the cone. It seems like you said, additions have been coming out over time as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Let me fill in on some of that. I'm perplexed too of the missed messaging on Beryl because I was following it from about the time it was on the Yucatan to landfall. Local emergency managers were picking up on what the Weather Service and Hurricane Center was putting out and really highlighting that the potential landfall of the center is going to produce a lot of adverse weather in the Houston area. And as it became more certain that we would be in the right front quadrant of it, they were putting out exactly what happened, that we would have widespread power outages and it would take 5 days to 2 weeks. These are the long-term emergency managers, the kind of people that we know are being used by the media and are being followed by the people on there. But then, like Hal said, the feedback you get from people is, I had no idea I was going to lose power for that long. How could that happen with a Category 1, which is a whole nother story. It's the same reason you can't get rid of the cone, the same reason it's going to be hard to change perceptions on using indexes, because index always has a lower probability. What I found was that the emergency managers, by and large, understand the cone quite well. Even when 15 years ago, when I was miscommunicating that information, they knew what it meant. The some of the challenge that still is out there that I saw in Ian is that even though we don't put the line on the graphic anymore, people put it on there, the center line on that, and they get focused on that. I find the utility of the cone is it is where the core of the hurricane is expected to be, and that would be where the worst impacts, certainly from the wind, are likely to be in that. But I really don't know how that message got missed on the power. I mean, and even afterwards, our local officials went ballistic on the power company, which was probably there's probably some truth to it, but I was surprised. That meant they didn't understand it either.
Yeah, I think those are great points. I think the power thing is tricky because I think there are also places to shore up the power infrastructure, or, you know, with these more extreme events, power outages can happen more often. I mean, you've seen that in Texas with weather. We've seen that in Colorado with fires. So we've had our power go out a number of times this year already when there's nothing happening because of various kinds of things. And so for people to be prepared for that, as well as for the infrastructure to be more robust to those kinds of things. I think when you're talking about this miscommunication with Beryl, one thing I think would be amazing to do in the future that we've been talking about, and it's just a matter of kind of making it happen, is to do real-time adjustment of risk communication using data, like we were talking before, about what people are misunderstanding. So when, you know, weather forecasters communicate, you get a sense of what people are misunderstanding by, you know, who writes in or what you hear from your neighbors. But we could actually collect data about what people are thinking and say, oh, they're understanding these things, but they're misunderstanding the power outage issue, and we need to go with that. And you have to do that quickly enough, like within 24 hours or even shorter, so you can shift the messaging or shift which aspect of the messaging you emphasize. And, you know, like political campaigns and marketing campaigns, they're doing this all the time. They're gathering data on their messaging. They're testing them. They're seeing, oh, we put this ad out. What do people think? Do we need to adjust our ads? And, you know, the potential is there to do that for weather communication as well. And I think, you know, that would be amazing. And hopefully then we would at least be able to try to adjust on the fly. See what the key messages that are being misunderstood are, or even which are being misunderstood among different audiences, and then focus the communication, you know, in different audiences and kind of emphasizing the key points that people might be misunderstanding.
Wow, that's a great idea. I wonder if any of the folks out in media land have tried out any technology that could help doing that, because it sounds like if there's an application that can automate a lot of that, it's doable. But if it requires a lot of manpower to actually get a feel for what's going on and deal with it, I would think.
Yeah, I don't know if anyone else wants to answer that. I mean, from what I know, there are tools, for example, to monitor social media, but they're not specific enough yet that I know of. I mean, maybe with new AI advances, it can be possible, but it can be really hard to really understand the details of what people are saying about events like this, because the way people, you know, communicate are so variable. We've been working with doing surveys in real time, just as a test strategy to see how that works, and been able to do it successfully. So I think there's a lot of tools from other kinds of like marketing and, you know, other kinds of communication where there's a lot more money involved, where there are tools we might be able to adapt from those to be able to use.
Rebecca, that's really interesting insights. I mean, we could, I think, you know, do a lot of that online, just as we're seeing the message hit these different social media boards, getting feedback. And with GeoTrack, we try to get on the ground a day or two before a hurricane strike. And it's amazing. You can just feel the different societal responses, like depending on the storm and where you're at. I noticed a day or two on the ground before Hurricane Ian, just going into a Publix that's right in the middle of the cone the day before landfall. Everything's open. People, you would have just thought it's a Saturday afternoon in Cleveland. I mean, you would have never known there's a Cat 3 bearing down. And you know, you can sometimes get this feel too from what we're seeing on the ground in the days and hours before a storm. And I think online as well. And I love that idea of real-time feedback, because sometimes you can tell maybe the messaging isn't reaching the people. We're seeing a different response in this kind of storm.
Right. I think with Ian, like you said, it was obvious people who were there. I mean, from someone who was far away, I could see it from the news stories where people were interviewing people and were reporting from there. You could see that it was going to happen. My sense is the National Hurricane Center kind of knew this to some extent, and maybe there, I guess the other piece of that is not only knowing what's going on, like you say, but getting that information soon enough and being able to know how to adapt the communication. I think there's a lot of, especially like I said, in marketing, political campaigns, so on, like how do you shift your communication? I think people tried in Ian because they knew it was an issue, but yeah, so I guess there's that other piece of it to understand and then be able to quickly get the information out and get it through the right channels to people so that people are hearing it quickly.
Thanks, Rebecca. Amazing insights. Tim, anything else come in online? Any other questions or interactions?
Yeah, I got one more question from Barry as we get close to the end of the program here, and he's always got some good insight as well. And I'm almost going to read this verbatim because it's easier. But he's concerned about Tampa Bay in particular. And he said the last multi-hazard hurricane there was 1921, so it's been over 100 years.
Yeah.
Had a couple of near misses in 17 and 22. In both of those instances, the Bay got pushed out, and people were walking around in Tampa Bay. You remember seeing those pictures from that? So he says, given A, 2 perceived false alarms, B, nobody's alive now that remembers 1921, and C, most people are not multi-generational residents. How do we address all that? It's been over 100 years, and the last couple of near misses, people were walking around in Tampa Bay. How do you express that that's not always going to be the case?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think when there are areas like this, you know, communication in the off season can do a lot. We had a study where we showed people a visualization, a simulated movie of a storm surge coming in, and it just so happened that those same people got a hurricane the next year, and they said that that information really helped them understand what it could be like. And so I think, you know, I think that's important. I think that's a great question. As I'm sure Barry knows, one of my colleagues, Julie Demuth, has done a lot of work on how people interpret experience. And how people interpret experience is so variable depending on, you know, their point of view. And so, yeah, I think that's an important question. I think knowing that that could be an issue can really be helpful because it means that the communicators, the broadcasters, weather service, and so on can be ready so that if there's a threat of another storm there, they can start communicating as early as possible to get the information to people. So that they can start thinking about it and make decisions. I think the hardest thing is to make decisions in a few hours, right? So you have a few days to get used to it, get used to the idea this could really happen. And then as the information gets better, you know, make a decision. I think that's a difficult question. I think the other thing is when you're concerned about a population, you know, getting the information in as many ways as possible is great. So to have connections with local community groups who will be communicating with people so that the message is coming to people from different places in as many ways as possible when the situation happens, so they can really start to wrap their mind around it and know what to do and see that other people are doing things, see that people that they trust are preparing and doing things also can be really helpful in helping people make decisions.
A terrific take on all of that. We really appreciate that. I know Barry appreciates that as well. I'm, you know, firm believer in you don't tell them what to expect, you show them what to expect. You've got to show them. They've got to see it. And that's a project we're working on for, you know, maybe for next hurricane season, we can show people what to expect when something's threatening. Let me see if Hal has any a final question or final thought before we wrap up. Hal?
Yeah. Rebecca, how can our audience find you and the great work you're doing online if they want to read more and find out about the work you're doing?
Yeah, well, my name is Rebecca Morss, and so it's an unusual spelling, so you can Google search me and find me and look at my webpage and my email address. I'm happy to answer questions when I can. And then I have a number of amazing colleagues and other people doing work in this area. So if there are things you're interested in, you can reach out to me. My email is my last name, morss@ucar.edu. And it might be something that I don't know about, but hopefully I know someone who does. And so there's just a lot of amazing work in this area going on right now.
Terrific. Bill?
Yeah, one area that we didn't talk about that this last discussion about modifying the messaging on the fly as a storm comes in is my feeling is that we've got to get people to at least do some rudimentary planning. Here's what I'm going to do if there is a hurricane happening. We can get more people to do that. If they haven't done that, you change the messaging, but they don't have a plan on what to do. You just add to the chaos, I think. So I think if they have a plan, oh, okay, this means I better go do this now, we'll get a better response out of it. Great subject. I love the work you do.
Thanks. Great thought.
Dr. Morss, any final thoughts before we let you go? It's 11 o'clock, time to wrap this up, but we'll give you the last remark here.
No, thanks for this opportunity. It's great to hear people talking about this and
and thinking about these kinds of issues. I think there's so much important work to do. And so thank you all for the great work that you do as well.
We appreciate you being with us today. A fascinating conversation that I feel like we could go for another hour easily. There's just so much to talk about. And thanks to all the great people who had questions online today as well. So great program today. Dr. Morss, Hurricane Hal, Bill Reed, thank you so much. Alex, back in the control room, thanks for making things happen. Let's thank our sponsors once again who are here week in and week out. USAA, the South Padre Island Convention and Visitors Bureau, the Weather Company, Weather Boy, and Weather Call, our sponsors of NTWC Plus. That wraps it up for this week. Next week, our friend Leslie Chapman Henderson from Flash, Federal Alliance for Safe Homes, will be with us. Another great conversation about, I'm sure, being hurricane ready, storm ready, or whatever the topic of the day will be. She's always a great guest as well. So thanks for being with us today. We'll see you again next week, same time for NTWC Plus. Take care. Bye-bye.